The rain fell heavily on the cobblestone streets of London as Thomas Whitmore stepped out of Clarence House for the last time as an active member of the Royal Protection Command. After 23 years of dedicated service to the British royal family, he carried with him more than just memories of state dinners and royal tours. He carried a burden that had grown heavier with each passing day, a secret so profound that it had slowly eaten away at his conscience until he could no longer remain silent. Thomas had served many members of the royal household throughout his distinguished career. He had protected Princess Diana during her final years, stood guard outside the Queen's private chambers, and accompanied Prince Charles on countless official engagements. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for what he would witness during his final posting as part of Queen Camilla's personal security detail. The story begins 3 years before Thomas's retirement, on a crisp autumn morning when he was reassigned to Queen Camilla's protection team. At first, the assignment seemed like a natural progression in his career. He had the experience, the clearance, and the impeccable record required for such a sensitive position. What he did not have was any indication of what he was about to discover. During his first weeks on the new assignment, Thomas noticed nothing unusual. Camilla went about her royal duties with practiced efficiency. She attended charity events, hosted garden parties, and fulfilled her obligations with the dedication expected of someone in her position. To the outside world, she appeared to be the devoted wife of King Charles and a committed servant to the crown and country. However, as Thomas became more integrated into the inner circle of her security detail, he began to notice peculiarities in her schedule. There were private meetings that were not recorded in the official court calendar. There were visits to locations that seemed to have no connection to her charitable work or royal responsibilities. Most troubling of all, there were phone calls that she insisted on taking in complete privacy, dismissing even her most trusted staff members from the room. The first real warning sign came during a routine protection assignment at Highgrove House. Thomas was conducting a standard security sweep of the private wing when he overheard a heated telephone conversation coming from Camilla's study. The door was slightly ajar, and though he knew he should not listen, something in the urgency of her tone made him pause. She was speaking to someone about financial transfers, using terms and references that seemed completely out of character for a member of the royal family, discussing legitimate business. Thomas tried to dismiss what he had heard as innocent, perhaps related to one of her many charitable foundations, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following months, he began to pay closer attention to the patterns in her behavior. He started keeping mental notes of the irregularities, not out of any desire to betray his duty, but because his training had taught him to recognize when something was not quite right. The second incident occurred during a state visit to Scotland. Camilla had insisted on a private side trip to Edinburgh, claiming she wanted to visit an old friend who was unwell. The official explanation seemed reasonable enough, but Thomas noticed that none of the usual protocols were followed. There was no advanced security sweep of the location, no coordination with local police, and no formal record of the visit in the daily briefing documents. Against standing orders, Thomas decided to conduct his own discreet investigation into the Edinburgh visit. What he discovered troubled him deeply. The address Camilla had visited belonged to a private wealth management firm with a reputation for handling sensitive financial matters for high-net-worth individuals. The firm specialized in offshore accounts and complex trust arrangements, services that seemed to have no legitimate connection to Camilla's royal duties. As Thomas dug deeper, he found himself caught between his duty to protect the royal family and his obligation to uphold the law. He began to compile evidence carefully, documenting dates, times, and locations of suspicious activities. He kept his observations to himself, uncertain of whom he could trust with such sensitive information. The weight of what he was discovering began to affect his sleep, his relationships, and his peace of mind. The situation escalated dramatically during a winter evening at Buckingham Palace. Thomas was on duty outside a private reception room when he witnessed something that would change everything. Through a service corridor window, he observed Camilla meeting with 3 individuals who were definitely not part of her usual social circle. The men were dressed in expensive suits, but there was something about their demeanor that suggested they were not typical business associates of the royal family. After the meeting concluded and the visitors had left, Thomas managed to obtain access to the palace security footage from the entrance cameras. He ran facial recognition checks on the three men using the police database he still had access to through his law enforcement connections. What came back shocked him to his core. Two of the three men had connections to international financial networks that had been under investigation by multiple governments for money laundering and tax evasion schemes. Thomas realized he was now in possession of information that could potentially shake the foundations of the British monarchy. He spent sleepless nights wrestling with the implications of what he knew. If he came forward with his suspicions, he would be breaking his oath of confidentiality and potentially destroying his own career and reputation. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in covering up activities that appeared to be illegal and deeply unethical. The final straw came when Thomas accidentally discovered a hidden safe in one of Camilla's private offices during a routine security check. The safe had been concealed behind a portrait of King Charles, and Thomas only found it because he was testing a new electronic detection device designed to locate hidden compartments. Inside the safe, visible through a partially opened door that had apparently been left unlocked by mistake, Thomas glimpsed stacks of documents that appeared to be financial records, along with several passports bearing different names but showing photographs that looked remarkably like Camilla at various ages. Standing in that private office, looking at evidence that suggested a carefully constructed secret life, Thomas Whitmore made a decision that would alter the course of British royal history. He photographed everything he could with his personal phone, knowing that by doing so he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. He carefully closed the safe and left the room, his heart pounding with the knowledge that he now possessed evidence of something far more sinister than he had ever imagined. The question that haunted him as he left Clarence House that rainy evening was not whether to reveal what he knew, but rather how to do so in a way that would ensure the truth came to light, while protecting himself from the powerful forces that would inevitably try to silence him. He had no illusions about the danger he was placing himself in. The British establishment had a long history of protecting the monarchy at all costs, and those who threatened to expose royal scandals often found themselves discredited, dismissed, or worse. Thomas Whitmore sat in his modest flat in South London, staring at the encrypted flash drive on his kitchen table. The small device contained copies of all the evidence he had gathered over the past 18 months. Photographs of documents, video recordings, detailed notes of suspicious meetings, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic deception at the highest levels of British society. He knew that once he made his next move, there would be no going back to the quiet life he had known. The decision of whom to trust with this information kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights. Going to his superiors in the Royal Protection Command was out of the question. They would either dismiss his claims as the paranoid fantasies of a burnt-out officer, or worse, they would suppress the evidence to protect the institution they were sworn to serve. The British police seemed equally problematic, as they ultimately answered to the same establishment that would want to keep this scandal buried. After careful consideration, Thomas decided his best option was to reach out to investigative journalists known for their integrity and their willingness to take on powerful institutions. He spent weeks researching different reporters, looking for someone with a track record of handling sensitive material responsibly and the courage to publish stories that challenged the status quo. He finally settled on Sarah Mitchell, an award-winning journalist who had previously exposed corruption in Parliament and misconduct in the financial sector. Thomas arranged a meeting with Sarah through a series of encrypted messages and intermediaries. They met in a busy coffee shop in Camden, a location chosen specifically because it would be difficult to conduct surveillance without being noticed. Sarah arrived precisely on time, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an air of professional skepticism that Thomas found reassuring rather than off-putting. He spent 2 hours laying out everything he had discovered about Queen Camilla's secret activities. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. When Thomas finished, she sat back in her chair and studied him carefully. She asked him questions designed to test the reliability of his story and his motivations for coming forward. Thomas answered each question honestly, holding nothing back about his own doubts and fears regarding what he was doing. Sarah agreed to investigate the story further, but she made it clear that she would need to verify his evidence independently before publishing anything. She also warned him that once the story became public, his life would change dramatically. He would face accusations of betrayal, legal challenges, and possible criminal charges for violating his security clearances. Thomas nodded, accepting these realities as the price of exposing the truth. Over the next several weeks, Sarah worked quietly to corroborate Thomas's claims. She reached out to sources in the financial industry, former palace staff members, and international investigators who specialized in tracking hidden wealth. What she discovered confirmed and expanded upon what Thomas had provided. The network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and secret financial arrangements was far more extensive than even Thomas had realized. Sarah discovered that Camilla had been building this hidden financial empire for over 20 years, starting long before she married Prince Charles. The operation appeared to have been set up with the help of a small group of financial advisors and lawyers who specialized in creating untraceable wealth structures for ultra-high net worth individuals. The amounts involved were staggering, running into hundreds of millions of pounds. The most disturbing aspect of Sarah's investigation was the source of much of this hidden wealth. Through careful analysis of the financial flows, she traced significant portions of the money back to foreign governments and private individuals who had business interests that could be affected by British government policies. In essence, it appeared that Camilla had been accepting payments from entities that stood to benefit from having influence within the royal family. One particularly troubling connection involved a Middle Eastern businessman who had made several large transfers to accounts controlled by Camilla's network. This same businessman had subsequently received favorable treatment in negotiating contracts with British companies for major infrastructure projects in his home country. While there was no direct evidence that Camilla had used her influence to facilitate these deals, the timing and amounts of the payments suggested a clear quid pro quo arrangement. As Sarah pieced together the full scope of the scandal, she realized this was not just a story about financial impropriety. This was about the fundamental integrity of the British monarchy and its relationship with the British people. The royal family derived its position and privileges from the implicit understanding that they served the national interest rather than personal gain. If Camilla had been secretly enriching herself through influence peddling, it represented a betrayal of the core principles that justified the monarchy's continued existence. Sarah also uncovered evidence suggesting that some members of the royal household had been aware of at least some of Camilla's activities but had chosen to look the other way. There were internal memos discussing concerns about unexplained absences from the official schedule and questions about certain associations that seemed inappropriate for someone in her position. However, these concerns had apparently been dismissed or suppressed by senior officials who preferred to avoid any scandal that might damage the monarchy's reputation. The investigation took an ominous turn when Sarah began to notice signs that someone was monitoring her activities. Her phone started exhibiting strange behaviors, suggesting it might be compromised. She noticed the same vehicle parked outside her apartment on multiple occasions with different drivers, but the same license plate pattern, suggesting it belonged to a government motor pool. Her editor at the newspaper began receiving anonymous calls warning him about the consequences of publishing unverified allegations against the royal family. Sarah took these warning signs seriously and implemented additional security measures. She stored copies of all her evidence in multiple secure locations, including with her lawyer, and in encrypted cloud storage accounts accessible only through complex authentication procedures. She informed several trusted colleagues about the general nature of her investigation, ensuring that if anything happened to her, others would know where to look for the story. Meanwhile, Thomas was experiencing his own form of pressure. Shortly after his retirement became official, he was contacted by representatives of the royal household requesting a meeting to discuss certain concerns about security protocols during his service. The tone of the invitation was polite but carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. Thomas declined the meeting, recognizing it for what it was, an attempt to assess how much he knew and whether he could be persuaded to remain silent. The pressure on Thomas intensified when he received a visit from two men who identified themselves as representatives of the security services. They expressed concerns about his recent activities and suggested that he might have come into possession of classified information that could compromise national security if disclosed. They offered him a generous consulting contract in exchange for his agreement to sign additional non-disclosure agreements and turn over any sensitive materials he might have retained from his time in royal service. Thomas refused their offer, though the encounter left him shaken. He realized that powerful forces were already moving to contain the potential damage from his revelations. He contacted Sarah to warn her about the increased surveillance and pressure, and they agreed to accelerate their timeline for publishing the story before they could be effectively silenced. Sarah worked around the clock to finalize her investigation and prepare the story for publication. She consulted with the newspaper's legal team to ensure that every claim could be substantiated with documentary evidence. She reached out to Clarence House for official comment on her findings, presenting them with a detailed list of allegations and the evidence supporting each one. The response came swiftly and predictably, a blanket denial of all wrongdoing accompanied by thinly veiled threats of legal action if the story was published. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Sarah managed to obtain testimony from a former financial advisor who had helped establish some of Camilla's offshore structures. The advisor, facing his own legal troubles related to other clients, was willing to provide detailed information about how the system worked and who else had been involved in maintaining it over the years. His testimony confirmed that Camilla had been fully aware of and actively involved in managing her hidden financial network. As the publication date approached, both Thomas and Sarah understood they were about to set in motion events that would reverberate through British society for years to come. They had exposed not just individual misconduct but systemic failures in how the royal family was monitored and held accountable. The question now was whether the British public and establishment would have the courage to confront these uncomfortable truths or whether they would choose to shoot the messengers and preserve the comfortable fiction of royal propriety. The morning the story broke, Britain woke up to headlines that would dominate the national conversation for months to come. Sarah Mitchell's carefully researched article appeared on the front page of The Guardian, with the stark headline, "Hidden Millions, the Secret Financial Network of Queen Camilla." Within hours, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country and was spreading rapidly across international media. The article laid out in meticulous detail the evidence of Camilla's hidden financial empire. It included copies of documents showing the structure of offshore accounts, timelines of suspicious meetings and financial transfers, and testimony from multiple sources including Thomas Whitmore, whose identity Sarah had revealed with his permission. The story carefully avoided making accusations it could not prove, but the implications were clear. The Queen Consort appeared to have been operating a sophisticated system for receiving and concealing wealth from questionable sources. The immediate reaction from Buckingham Palace was defensive and angry. Within 2 hours of publication, the palace released a statement, categorically denying all allegations and characterizing the story as a malicious attack on the monarchy based on fabricated evidence and the testimony of a disgruntled former employee. The statement suggested that Thomas Whitmore had been dismissed from royal service for misconduct and was seeking revenge through false accusations. This counterattack against Thomas's character was anticipated, and Sarah's newspaper was prepared with evidence proving that he had retired honorably, with commendations from his superiors. They published Thomas's service record along with letters of appreciation from various members of the royal family, including one from Camilla herself, praising his dedication and professionalism. The palace's attempt to discredit him quickly backfired, making them appear dishonest and desperate. Public reaction to the revelations was immediate and intense. Social media platforms erupted with heated debates about the monarchy's role in modern Britain. Some defended Camilla, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that she deserved the presumption of innocence. Others saw the allegations as confirmation of their long-held suspicions that the royal family was fundamentally corrupt and out of touch with ordinary citizens who struggled with the rising cost of living while the royals apparently enriched themselves through shady financial dealings. The political implications were equally significant. Members of Parliament from across the political spectrum called for a full investigation into the allegations. The opposition party seized on the scandal as evidence that the monarchy needed radical reform or perhaps abolishment altogether. Even some members of the Conservative Party, traditionally staunch defenders of the royal family, expressed concern about the seriousness of the allegations and the need for transparency and accountability. King Charles found himself in an impossible position. As Camilla's husband, he was expected to defend her publicly. As the head of state and the embodiment of the monarchy as an institution, he needed to be seen as taking the allegations seriously and ensuring that proper procedures were followed. His initial response was to retreat into silence, canceling several scheduled public appearances and holding emergency meetings with his closest advisors to determine the best course of action. Behind the scenes at the palace, there was near panic. Senior advisors were divided on how to handle the crisis. Some argued for full transparency, suggesting that Camilla should release all her financial records and submit to questioning by independent investigators. Others insisted that the monarchy could not afford to show any sign of weakness or admission of wrongdoing, as it would open the floodgates to endless scrutiny and criticism. The scandal took on an international dimension when several of the foreign entities identified in Sarah's reporting issued their own statements. Some denied ever having financial dealings with Camilla or anyone connected to her. Others remained silent, which many interpreted as confirmation of the reported relationships. Financial regulators in multiple countries announced they would review the transactions in question to determine if any laws had been violated. Thomas Whitmore became an overnight celebrity. Though not one he had sought or wanted, his face appeared on television screens around the world as news programs dissected every aspect of his career and personal life. He gave a carefully prepared statement at a press conference organized by Sarah's newspaper, explaining his motivations for coming forward and expressing his hope that the truth would ultimately prevail, despite the powerful forces arrayed against him. The press conference was a crucial moment in shaping public perception of the scandal. Thomas spoke calmly and without obvious anger or vindictiveness. He emphasized that he had taken no pleasure in revealing this information and had struggled with the decision for months before, concluding that his duty to the truth and to the British people outweighed his oath of confidentiality to the royal family. His sincerity was apparent, and even many who were skeptical of the allegations found him credible and sympathetic. The legal battles began almost immediately. Clarence House filed a lawsuit against The Guardian for defamation, seeking substantial damages and a retraction of the article. The newspaper's legal team had anticipated this and had prepared a robust defense based on the public interest in the story and the extensive evidence supporting the published claims. Legal experts noted that the defamation case would require Camilla to submit to discovery procedures that could expose even more details about her financial arrangements. Thomas also faced legal jeopardy. Government prosecutors announced they were reviewing his actions to determine if he had violated the Official Secrets Act or other laws protecting classified information. His lawyers argued that any prosecution would be an attempt to punish a whistleblower for exposing wrongdoing, and they prepared to fight the charges vigorously. Public opinion polls showed that a majority of Britons believed Thomas had done the right thing in coming forward, which put additional pressure on prosecutors to tread carefully. As the first week after the revelations unfolded, additional pieces of evidence began to emerge from unexpected sources. Former palace staff members who had remained silent for years started coming forward with their own observations and concerns about Camilla's activities. Some described seeing large amounts of cash being delivered to her private offices. Others recalled meetings with mysterious visitors who were never properly logged in the official records. Each new testimony added weight to the original allegations. One particularly damaging account came from a former secretary who had worked in Camilla's office for 3 years. She described being instructed to destroy certain documents and to keep no records of specific phone calls and meetings. The secretary said she had felt uncomfortable with these requests but had complied because she needed her job and feared the consequences of refusing orders from someone so powerful. Her testimony painted a picture of deliberate concealment and awareness that the activities in question were improper. The financial forensics experts who examined the evidence provided by Sarah Mitchell published their own analysis, which concluded that the pattern of transactions was consistent with money laundering and influence peddling. They noted that the sophistication of the offshore structures suggested professional assistance from experts in concealing wealth. The amounts involved, they calculated, could easily exceed £200 million when all the various accounts and assets were properly tallied. International pressure began to build as well. The United States Treasury Department announced it was reviewing whether any American financial institutions had been involved in potentially illegal transactions. The European Union's Financial Crimes Unit indicated it was coordinating with British authorities to investigate cross-border aspects of the case. What had started as a British royal scandal was evolving into an international financial investigation. Perhaps most damaging to Camilla's position was the emergence of recordings from several of the phone calls Thomas had documented. A whistleblower from one of the telecommunications companies involved provided encrypted copies of conversations in which Camilla discussed financial matters using language that strongly suggested she understood she was operating outside normal legal boundaries. While the recordings raised questions about surveillance legality, their content was devastating to any claim that she had been unaware of or uninvolved in managing the hidden financial network. King Charles finally broke his silence with a carefully worded statement expressing his love and support for his wife, while also acknowledging that serious questions had been raised that deserved proper investigation. He announced that he had requested an independent inquiry led by a respected former judge to review all the allegations and evidence. This response was seen as an attempt to appear responsive to public concern, while still defending Camilla and buying time for the palace to develop a longer-term strategy. The appointment of the independent inquiry was met with mixed reactions. Supporters of the monarchy praised it as evidence that the royal family was taking the matter seriously and was willing to subject itself to scrutiny. Critics dismissed it as a whitewash in the making, noting that the judge selected had close ties to the establishment and could be expected to find ways to minimize any damage to the monarchy. They demanded a parliamentary investigation with full powers to compel testimony and access to all relevant documents. As the third week of the scandal wore on, it became clear that this was not going to be a story that would fade quickly from public consciousness. The evidence was too substantial, the implications too serious, and the public interest too intense for the matter to be quietly swept away. Thomas Whitmore had succeeded in forcing a national reckoning with questions about the monarchy that many in the establishment had hoped would never be asked. The independent inquiry began its work amid intense public scrutiny and skepticism. Sir Malcolm Henderson, the retired High Court judge appointed to lead the investigation, promised a thorough and impartial examination of all evidence. However, his first actions did little to inspire confidence among critics. He immediately imposed strict confidentiality rules on the proceedings and resisted calls to hold public hearings, arguing that the sensitive nature of royal finances required discretion. Thomas Whitmore was among the first people called to testify before the inquiry. He spent 3 full days being questioned about his evidence, his methods of gathering information, and his motivations for coming forward. The inquiry's lawyers subjected him to aggressive cross-examination, attempting to find inconsistencies in his account or evidence of bias against Camilla. Thomas remained calm and consistent throughout, providing detailed answers and offering to submit to any verification procedures they deemed necessary. During his testimony, Thomas revealed additional information he had not included in his original disclosure to Sarah Mitchell. He described conversations he had overheard between Camilla and her financial advisors, discussing strategies to move assets between jurisdictions to avoid detection by tax authorities. He provided dates and times of meetings that could be cross-referenced with other documentary evidence. Most significantly, he testified about a conversation he had accidentally witnessed between Camilla and King Charles, in which she appeared to be defending her financial arrangements to him, suggesting the king had at least some awareness of her activities. This testimony about Charles's potential knowledge of Camilla's financial dealings created a constitutional crisis within the already explosive scandal. If the king had known about illegal or improper financial activities and had done nothing to stop them or report them to appropriate authorities, his own position could be called into question. The palace moved quickly to deny that Charles had any knowledge of the specifics of Camilla's finances beyond normal spousal awareness of household matters. As the inquiry continued its work, Sarah Mitchell and her team of investigative journalists kept digging. They discovered that several prominent politicians had received campaign contributions from individuals and organizations connected to Camilla's financial network. While there was no evidence that Camilla herself had directed these contributions, the connections raised troubling questions about whether political influence had been purchased to protect her interests and ensure that regulatory oversight remained weak. One particularly damaging revelation involved a former cabinet minister who had received substantial consulting fees from a company that turned out to be one of Camilla's shell corporations. This minister had been responsible for policies related to financial regulation and offshore tax havens during his time in government. Sarah's reporting suggested that his policies had consistently favored the types of arrangements that Camilla had used to conceal her wealth. The minister denied any impropriety, but the circumstantial evidence of conflict of interest was compelling. The scandal expanded further when documents emerged showing that some of the money flowing through Camilla's accounts had originated from sources with even more questionable backgrounds than previously known. Intelligence services from friendly nations provided information indicating that at least one of her major benefactors had ties to organized crime networks operating in Eastern Europe. While there was no suggestion that Camilla was aware of these criminal connections, the revelation that she had been accepting money from such sources was deeply damaging. Public protests began to materialize in London and other major British cities. Thousands of people took to the streets demanding accountability and transparency from the royal family. The protests were largely peaceful but reflected a genuine anger among many ordinary citizens who saw the scandal as evidence of a two-tier system where the wealthy and powerful played by different rules than everyone else. The crowds chanted slogans calling for the monarchy to be abolished or dramatically reformed. Inside the palace walls, the mood was grim. Staff members described an atmosphere of paranoia and recrimination. Courtiers who had served the royal family for decades found themselves under suspicion of having either enabled Camilla's activities or having failed to detect and report them. Several senior officials offered to resign, though their offers were not immediately accepted as palace leadership feared that high-profile departures would be interpreted as admissions of guilt. Camilla herself remained largely out of public view during this period. She canceled all her scheduled engagements, citing health concerns. The few photographs of her that emerged showed a woman who appeared strained and aged by the stress of the scandal. Friends and supporters described her as devastated by the accusations and insistent on her innocence. However, she declined to give any interviews or make any public statements beyond the official palace denials, a silence that many interpreted as evidence of guilt. The financial markets began to react to the instability created by the scandal. The pound sterling declined in value as international investors worried about political uncertainty in Britain. Tourism officials expressed concern that the damage to the royal family's reputation could affect one of Britain's most important industries. Business leaders warned that the scandal was harming Britain's international standing at a time when the country could ill afford distractions from economic challenges. The inquiry's work was complicated by the discovery that some key documents appeared to have been destroyed. Digital forensics experts examining computer systems used by Camilla's office found evidence that files had been deliberately deleted using sophisticated wiping software designed to make recovery impossible. The timing of these deletions, which occurred shortly after Thomas Whitmore's retirement and in the weeks before Sarah Mitchell's story was published, suggested a conscious effort to conceal evidence. This apparent destruction of evidence became a major focus of the investigation. Sir Malcolm Henderson issued a stern statement, warning that obstruction of the inquiry would be treated as a serious matter and could lead to criminal referrals. He demanded that anyone with knowledge of document destruction come forward immediately. The statement was widely seen as directed at Camilla and her inner circle, though it carefully avoided naming anyone specifically. Under pressure from Parliament and public opinion, the government announced that it would be conducting its own investigation in parallel with the Henderson inquiry. The Serious Fraud Office, Britain's agency responsible for investigating complex financial crimes, opened a formal case file. This was a significant escalation because, unlike the Henderson inquiry, the Serious Fraud Office had full law enforcement powers, including the ability to compel testimony under oath and to bring criminal charges if warranted. Thomas Whitmore cooperated fully with the Serious Fraud Office investigation. providing them with access to all his evidence and agreeing to assist their investigators in any way they needed. He appeared before a grand jury to give formal testimony that could be used in potential criminal proceedings. Throughout this process, he maintained his composure. Despite the enormous pressure he was under and the personal attacks he continued to face from royal family supporters, the legal situation became even more complex when several of the foreign entities involved in the financial network sought to assert immunity from British jurisdiction. Some claimed diplomatic immunity, while others argued that their transactions had taken place entirely outside British territory and therefore were not subject to British law. These legal maneuvers threatened to make it difficult or impossible to fully unravel the extent of the financial network and hold all responsible parties accountable. International cooperation became crucial to the investigation's success. British investigators worked with counterparts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, Monaco, and other jurisdictions known for banking secrecy and offshore finance. Some of these countries were more cooperative than others, reflecting their own interest in either preserving banking secrecy or demonstrating their commitment to fighting financial crime. The process was slow and frustrating, with each request for information requiring complex legal procedures and diplomatic negotiations. As the investigation dragged on through the spring and into summer, public attention began to wane slightly, though interest remained much higher than normal for a royal story. The Henderson inquiry issued interim reports that acknowledged serious concerns about financial irregularities while stopping short of making definitive findings of criminal conduct. These carefully worded reports satisfied no one, with critics seeing them as confirmation of the whitewash they had predicted and royal supporters finding even the acknowledgement of problems too damaging. Behind the scenes, negotiations were taking place about possible resolutions to the crisis. Intermediaries floated proposals that would have involved Camilla making substantial charitable contributions in exchange for an end to the investigations and some form of public rehabilitation. These trial balloons were met with fierce opposition from those who believed that justice required full accountability, regardless of Camilla's status. The negotiations failed to produce any agreement, ensuring that the legal processes would continue to their conclusions. The strain on the royal family was evident in the changing dynamics between its members. Prince William and other senior royals maintained a careful distance from Camilla, avoiding being photographed with her or making any statements that could be interpreted as supporting her position. This visible distancing suggested deep divisions within the family about how to handle the crisis and perhaps about Camilla's role in the monarchy going forward. As summer turned to autumn, the scandal showed no signs of reaching a quick resolution. The investigations continued to uncover new information, each revelation adding to the public's understanding of how extensive and deliberate Camilla's financial arrangements had been. The question was no longer whether she had maintained secret accounts and accepted questionable money, but rather what consequences she would face for doing so, and whether the monarchy itself could survive the damage to its reputation. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A banker in Luxembourg who had managed one of the key accounts in Camilla's financial network decided to cooperate with investigators after being offered immunity from prosecution. His decision appeared to be motivated by both self-preservation and a genuine crisis of conscience about his role in what he now understood to be a systematic scheme to conceal wealth and potentially launder money from dubious sources. The banker, whose identity was protected by the terms of his immunity agreement, provided investigators with detailed records spanning more than 15 years. These records included not just transaction histories but also email correspondence, meeting notes, and recorded phone conversations that had been maintained as part of the bank's internal compliance procedures. The material painted the most complete picture yet of how Camilla's financial empire had been constructed and operated. What emerged from these documents was evidence that Camilla had been far more actively involved in managing her hidden finances than the palace had claimed. The records showed her directly approving major transactions, giving instructions about where to move assets, and discussing strategies to minimize scrutiny from tax authorities. In several recorded conversations, she demonstrated detailed knowledge of international financial regulations and how to structure arrangements to exploit loopholes and jurisdictional ambiguities. Perhaps most damaging were communications. that showed Camilla explicitly linking certain financial arrangements to specific favors or access she could provide. In one email exchange, she discussed a substantial payment from a foreign businessman in the context of arranging a private dinner with senior British government officials. While the language was carefully coded and never explicitly stated quid pro quo, the timing and context made the nature of the arrangement clear to investigators. When news of the banker's cooperation and the new evidence leaked to the press, public outrage reached new heights. The revelations directly contradicted the palace's narrative that Camilla had been an innocent party who had trusted her financial advisors to handle routine matters and had no knowledge of any impropriety. The evidence showed someone who was not only aware of but actively directing sophisticated financial schemes designed to evade taxes and conceal the sources and purposes of large sums of money. The Serious Fraud Office used this evidence to escalate its investigation significantly. Prosecutors began preparing potential criminal charges, including tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the public revenue. Legal experts noted that these were serious felony charges that could theoretically result in imprisonment, though the practical question of whether a sitting queen consort could actually be prosecuted and jailed remained unprecedented and constitutionally murky. King Charles faced mounting pressure to take decisive action. Constitutional scholars debated whether he had the authority to strip Camilla of her royal titles, or whether that would require an act of parliament. Some argued that the king could effectively exile her from royal duties, while allowing her to retain her titles in name only. Others insisted that half measures would be insufficient, and that only her complete removal from the royal family would satisfy public demands for accountability. The political pressure on Charles intensified when the opposition leader in Parliament gave a major speech calling for the king to choose between his wife and his crown. The speech argued that the monarchy's continued existence depended on public confidence in its integrity, and that confidence had been shattered by the revelations about Camilla. While the speech was criticized by some as opportunistic and disrespectful, it reflected a genuine shift in public sentiment toward questioning whether the monarchy deserved to continue if it could not police itself. Thomas Whitmore watched these developments from his flat, which had become a fortress of security measures after he received several credible threats against his life. Private security guards rotated shifts outside his building, and he rarely ventured out except for necessary meetings with investigators and lawyers. Despite the personal cost, he expressed no regrets about his decision to come forward. In interviews, he emphasized that his loyalty had always been to the principles the monarchy was supposed to represent rather than to any individual member of the royal family. The Henderson inquiry finally issued its full report. After 9 months of investigation, the report was hundreds of pages long and included extensive documentation of Camilla's financial activities. While the language was carefully legalistic and avoided inflammatory rhetoric, the conclusions were devastating. The inquiry found that Camilla had maintained hidden financial arrangements that were inconsistent with her position and responsibilities as a member of the royal family. It concluded that she had failed to meet standards of transparency and had received money from sources that created conflicts of interest. Importantly, the Henderson report also criticized the systems and oversight mechanisms within the royal household for failing to detect or prevent Camilla's activities. It found that financial controls were inadequate, that there was insufficient independent scrutiny of senior royals' finances, and that a culture of deference had discouraged staff members from raising concerns about potential improprieties. The report made dozens of recommendations for reforms designed to prevent similar situations in the future. The palace's response to the Henderson report was to accept its findings and commit to implementing all recommended reforms. However, this response did little to address the fundamental question of what consequences Camilla herself would face. The palace statement expressed regret for the failures in oversight but continued to argue that Camilla had not intentionally violated any laws and had relied on professional advisors who had misled her about the propriety of various arrangements. This attempt to blame the advisors while protecting Camilla was widely rejected as implausible given the evidence of her direct involvement in managing the accounts. Several of the advisors in question gave their own press conferences in which they stated unequivocally that Camilla had been fully informed and had given explicit instructions about how to structure her finances. Some of these advisors were now cooperating with prosecutors in hopes of receiving more lenient treatment in exchange for their testimony against her. The climax of the legal proceedings came when the Serious Fraud Office announced that it was formally charging Camilla with multiple counts of tax evasion and money laundering. The charges were filed in a London magistrate's court, setting in motion a criminal prosecution that would test the limits of the British legal and constitutional system. The question of whether a queen consort enjoyed any immunity from prosecution had never been definitively answered, and legal arguments on both sides were prepared for what would inevitably be a prolonged battle through the courts. Camilla's legal team immediately filed motions to dismiss the charges on grounds that prosecuting her would be unconstitutional and contrary to centuries of precedent regarding the treatment of senior royals. They argued that the proper remedy for any wrongdoing was removal from royal duties rather than criminal prosecution, and that subjecting her to the criminal justice system would undermine the dignity and stability of the monarchy. The prosecutors countered that no one was above the law, and that allowing Camilla to escape accountability would establish a dangerous precedent that wealthy and powerful individuals could commit crimes with impunity. The constitutional crisis reached its peak when Parliament scheduled emergency debates on the future of the monarchy. For the first time in generations, there were serious discussions about whether Britain should transition to a republic. Polls showed that public support for the monarchy had dropped to historic lows, with younger voters particularly likely to favor abolition. The scandal had crystallized long-simmering frustrations about inequality, privilege, and accountability in British society. King Charles made a dramatic televised address to the nation in an attempt to address the crisis. Speaking from Buckingham Palace, he acknowledged that serious mistakes had been made and that public trust had been damaged. He announced that Camilla would be stepping back from all royal duties, pending the resolution of the legal proceedings against her. He committed to comprehensive reforms of royal finances and oversight. Most significantly, he expressed his own personal anguish over the situation and his determination to ensure that the monarchy earned back the public's confidence. The address was met with mixed reactions. Some praised Charles for finally taking meaningful action and speaking candidly about the crisis. Others saw it as too little, too late, and criticized him for not going far enough in holding Camilla accountable. The fact that she was merely stepping back from duties, rather than being completely removed from the royal family, was particularly controversial, with many viewing it as evidence that Charles was still prioritizing his personal relationship over his institutional responsibilities. Behind the scenes, Charles was reportedly devastated by the entire situation. Friends described him as torn between his love for Camilla and his duty to the crown. He had waited his entire life to become king, and now his reign was being defined by a scandal involving his wife, rather than by the causes and initiatives he had hoped to champion. The stress was taking a visible toll on his health and appearance, with observers noting that he seemed to have aged years in a matter of months. Camilla remained in seclusion at a private estate in Scotland, reportedly spending her days in consultation with her lawyers and trying to come to terms with how completely her world had collapsed. According to those who spoke with her, she continued to maintain that she had done nothing wrong, and that she was the victim of a witch hunt driven by people who had never accepted her marriage to Charles. However, these private assertions of innocence rang hollow given the overwhelming documentary evidence of her calculated efforts to conceal wealth and avoid taxes. The trial date was set for the following spring, ensuring that the scandal would continue to dominate British public life for many more months. Legal experts predicted that the proceedings could last for months given the complexity of the financial evidence and the novel constitutional questions involved. Both sides were assembling teams of the most prestigious lawyers money could buy, setting up a courtroom battle that would be watched by the entire world. As winter settled over Britain, the nation remained gripped by anticipation of the upcoming trial. The case had already generated thousands of pages of pre-trial motions and legal arguments. Camilla's defense team was pursuing every possible avenue to prevent the trial from moving forward, filing challenges in multiple courts simultaneously. They argued that the prosecution was politically motivated, that the evidence had been obtained improperly, and that ancient principles of sovereign immunity should protect her from criminal proceedings. The prosecution methodically defeated each of these challenges, though the process consumed months and cost taxpayers millions of pounds. Judges at various levels consistently ruled that the public interest in holding powerful individuals accountable outweighed any concerns about the unprecedented nature of prosecuting a queen consort. These rulings represented a fundamental shift in British legal thinking about the relationship between the monarchy and the law. Thomas Whitmore received notification that he would be a key witness at the trial. Prosecutors planned to have him testify about what he had observed during his time protecting Camilla and how he had gathered the evidence that initiated the entire investigation. His testimony would be crucial in establishing the timeline of events and demonstrating that Camilla had actively worked to conceal her financial activities from those who might question or report them. Preparing for his testimony required Thomas to relive the entire experience in minute detail. He spent weeks with prosecutors reviewing documents, timelines, and his own notes from the period when he was gathering evidence. The process was emotionally draining, forcing him to confront again the moral anguish he had felt when deciding whether to betray his oath of confidentiality to expose what he believed was serious wrongdoing. His legal team worked to ensure he would be protected from aggressive cross-examination tactics designed to discredit him as unreliable or vindictive. Meanwhile, investigators continued to uncover new dimensions of the scandal. They discovered that some of the money in Camilla's accounts had been used to make payments to individuals who could potentially have damaged information about her past. While these payments were structured to look like legitimate consulting fees or charitable donations, the pattern suggested they were actually hush money, designed to keep embarrassing or incriminating stories from becoming public. This revelation added potential charges of obstruction of justice and witness tampering to the already lengthy list of alleged crimes. One of the recipients of these suspicious payments was a former romantic partner from Camilla's youth who had threatened to publish a tell-all memoir. After receiving a substantial payment through one of her shell companies, the memoir project was quietly abandoned. When investigators tracked down this individual and confronted him with the evidence, he admitted that he had been paid to remain silent about certain aspects of Camilla's past, though he declined to specify what those aspects were without a guarantee of immunity from prosecution. The international dimensions of the case continued to expand as well. Authorities in several countries launched their own investigations into whether their citizens or institutions had been complicit in helping Camilla evade taxes or launder money. Some foreign banks that had processed transactions for her accounts faced potential fines and sanctions. The scandal had evolved from a British royal drama into a global financial crime case that implicated institutions and individuals across multiple continents. Public protests continued sporadically throughout the winter, though they became somewhat less frequent as the novelty of the scandal wore off and people settled into waiting for the trial. However, the underlying anger and disillusionment with the monarchy remained strong. Opinion polls consistently showed that a majority of Britons believed Camilla should be prosecuted and that the royal family needed fundamental reforms. Support for completely abolishing the monarchy, while still a minority position, had reached levels not seen since the turbulent period following Princess Diana's death. King Charles struggled to maintain any sense of normalcy in his royal duties while his wife awaited trial on serious criminal charges. His public appearances were marked by obvious discomfort and tension. He faced hostile questions from reporters at nearly every event, and several planned state visits were canceled because foreign governments were uncomfortable with the diplomatic complications of hosting a monarch whose consort was under criminal indictment. The strain was transforming Charles from a confident new king into a diminished figure fighting for the survival of his reign. Prince William and other members of the royal family maintained careful distance from the scandal, though they could not escape its impact entirely. William was reportedly furious with Camilla and had urged his father to take stronger action against her much earlier in the crisis. The relationship between William and his stepmother, never particularly warm, had completely collapsed. There were rumors that William had privately told his father that Camilla should be completely removed from the family and stripped of all titles, regardless of the personal cost to Charles. The younger royals faced particular challenges as they tried to continue their charitable work and public duties in the shadow of the scandal. Every appearance was overshadowed by questions about Camilla and the future of the monarchy. Young people in particular were openly hostile, viewing the entire royal family as symbols of an outdated and corrupt system. Several of the charitable organizations that had been associated with the royals quietly distanced themselves, not wanting their work to be tainted by association with the scandal. As the trial date approached, both sides engaged in strategic media campaigns designed to shape public opinion and potentially influence the jury pool. Camilla's supporters emphasized her charitable work and portrayed her as a victim of overzealous prosecutors and a vindictive press. They highlighted her age and health concerns, suggesting that the stress of prosecution was cruel and unnecessary. They painted Thomas Whitmore as a disloyal employee with a grudge, despite the overwhelming evidence supporting his claims. The prosecution's media strategy was more subtle but equally deliberate. Through carefully orchestrated leaks and off-the-record briefings, they ensured that damaging information about Camilla's financial activities continued to drip into public consciousness. Each new revelation reminded the public why the prosecution was necessary and undermined attempts to portray Camilla sympathetically. The prosecution wanted to ensure that any sympathy for Camilla as an elderly woman was balanced by awareness of the serious nature of her alleged crimes. The defense team attempted to negotiate a plea bargain that would allow Camilla to avoid trial in exchange for admitting to lesser charges and agreeing to pay substantial fines and back taxes. The prosecutors were willing to consider such an arrangement, as it would guarantee a conviction without the risks and uncertainties of a trial. However, any plea agreement would need to include an admission of criminal wrongdoing, and Camilla reportedly refused to make such an admission. Her lawyers conveyed that she was prepared to go to trial and fight the charges rather than accept any arrangement that required her to plead guilty. This decision to go to trial surprised many legal observers, who believed that Camilla's best option was to negotiate the most favorable plea deal possible and avoid the spectacle of a public trial. Some interpreted her refusal to plead guilty as evidence of genuine belief in her innocence, while others saw it as arrogance and a continued sense that the normal rules did not apply to someone of her status. Either way, the decision meant that the British public would be treated to a full airing of all the evidence in open court. Security preparations for the trial were extraordinary. The courthouse was fortified against potential attacks from protesters or extremists. Elaborate screening procedures were established for anyone seeking to attend the proceedings. Special arrangements were made to transport Camilla to and from court in ways that would minimize her exposure to hostile crowds. The government was taking no chances with what was certain to be the most high-profile and controversial trial in modern British history. Thomas Whitmore received round-the-clock protection as the trial approached, as intelligence services had detected credible plots to harm or kill him before he could testify. Some of these threats came from fanatical supporters of the monarchy, who viewed him as a traitor. Others came from individuals connected to the foreign entities whose relationships with Camilla were being exposed by the investigation. Thomas accepted these security measures stoically, viewing them as necessary costs of having done what he believed was right. The night before the trial was scheduled to begin, Thomas sat in his secure flat and reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about the day he had first overheard that suspicious phone call at Highgrove House, the moment he had decided to start documenting what he observed, and the terrible night when he had finally made the decision to bring his evidence to Sarah Mitchell. He wondered what his life would have been like if he had simply ignored what he had seen and completed his service in comfortable silence. But Thomas knew he could not have made a different choice. He had devoted his entire adult life to protecting and serving the royal family because he believed in what they represented. When he discovered that one of them was betraying those principles for personal gain, remaining silent would have been its own form of betrayal. Whatever happened in the trial, whatever consequences he faced for breaking his oath of confidentiality, he knew he had acted according to his deepest values and his sense of duty to truth and justice. The trial of Queen Consort Camilla began on a cold morning in late March at the Central Criminal Court in London. Known as the Old Bailey, the historic courthouse had witnessed countless significant trials over its long history, but none quite like this. Hundreds of journalists from around the world camped outside the building, their cameras trained on every entrance. Crowds of protesters and royal supporters faced off across police barricades, their competing chants creating a cacophony that could be heard inside the courtroom. Camilla arrived through a secure entrance, shielded from public view by a phalanx of security personnel and legal advisors. The woman who emerged in the courtroom looked markedly different from the confident queen consort, who had appeared at state functions just 2 years earlier. She appeared frail and nervous, dressed conservatively in a dark suit with minimal jewelry or adornment. Her legal team had clearly decided to present her as a sympathetic figure rather than someone who had wielded power and privilege to enrich herself. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a devastating narrative spanning 2 decades. Lead prosecutor Eleanor Fitzgerald methodically described how Camilla had constructed an elaborate system of offshore accounts, shell companies, and nominee arrangements designed to conceal wealth and avoid taxes. She detailed specific transactions that showed Camilla receiving payments from foreign businessmen and government officials who had interests in British policy decisions. Most damaging, she previewed evidence that would show Camilla personally directing these arrangements and deliberately concealing them from authorities. Fitzgerald's presentation lasted nearly 3 hours and included dozens of exhibits, bank records, emails, recorded phone conversations, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. She painted a picture of systematic fraud carried out over many years by someone who fully understood she was breaking the law, but believed her position would protect her from consequences. The prosecutor emphasized that this was not a case of innocent mistakes or misunderstandings, but rather deliberate criminal conduct by someone who had betrayed the trust placed in her by the British people. The defense's opening statement took a completely different approach. Camilla's lead attorney, Sir Geoffrey Morrison, acknowledged that she had maintained private financial arrangements but characterized them as entirely legitimate wealth management by someone from a privileged background who had always been wealthy independent of her royal status. He argued that the complex structures were designed not to evade taxes, but to protect privacy and manage investments efficiently across international boundaries. He portrayed the prosecution as a politically motivated attack on the monarchy driven by Republican sentiments and class resentment. Sir Geoffrey emphasized that Camilla had always relied on professional advisors who had assured her that all her arrangements were legal. He suggested that if any laws had been broken, the responsibility lay with those advisors rather than with Camilla herself. He promised to present evidence that she had specifically instructed her financial team to ensure full compliance with all applicable laws and that she had been misled about the true nature of some of the structures they had created. It was a strategy that attempted to portray Camilla as a victim of bad advice rather than the architect of a criminal scheme. Thomas Whitmore took the witness stand on the 4th day of the trial. The courtroom was packed with observers hoping to finally hear directly from the man whose revelations had sparked the entire scandal. Thomas appeared calm and professional as he was sworn in, his bearing reflecting his decades of military and law enforcement training. The prosecution led him through his testimony methodically, establishing his credentials, his role in protecting Camilla, and the circumstances that had led him to start documenting suspicious activities. Thomas described in detail the incidents that had raised his suspicions, the overheard phone conversations, the unscheduled meetings, the visits to locations that had no apparent connection to royal duties. He explained how he had struggled with the decision to document what he was observing, understanding that doing so potentially violated his oath of confidentiality, but believing that exposing possible criminal activity was a higher duty. His testimony was measured and credible, providing a foundation for the documentary evidence that would follow. The cross-examination of Thomas was fierce and prolonged. Sir Geoffrey attempted to portray him as a disgruntled employee who had manufactured evidence out of innocent observations. He questioned Thomas's methods of gathering information, suggesting that he had violated privacy and conducted unauthorized surveillance. He pressed Thomas on whether he had any personal animosity toward Camilla, or whether he had been paid by media organizations for his story. Thomas remained composed throughout, calmly explaining that his only motivation had been concern about what appeared to be illegal activities. One particularly tense exchange came when Sir Geoffrey suggested that Thomas had breached his security clearances and violated the Official Secrets Act by retaining and disclosing classified information. Thomas responded that there was no legitimate security justification for keeping evidence of criminal activity secret, and that his duty to the law superseded any administrative obligations to protect someone who was breaking that law. The exchange highlighted the fundamental tension at the heart of the case: whether loyalty to institutions should ever override obligations to truth and justice. Following Thomas's testimony, the prosecution called a series of financial experts who explained the technical details of Camilla's offshore arrangements. These witnesses demonstrated how the structures had been specifically designed to obscure the sources and amounts of money flowing into Camilla's control. They showed how transactions had been split and routed through multiple jurisdictions, specifically to avoid triggering reporting requirements that would have revealed them to tax authorities. The technical testimony was dry but damning, making clear that the arrangements were far too sophisticated to have been accidental or the result of innocent errors. The cooperating banker from Luxembourg provided some of the trial's most dramatic testimony. Speaking through special arrangements that protected his identity, he described years of conversations with Camilla in which she had given explicit instructions about managing her accounts and avoiding detection. He produced recordings of several of these conversations in which Camilla demonstrated detailed knowledge of international tax regulations and discussed strategies for exploiting loopholes. The recordings made it impossible to maintain the fiction that she had been a passive investor who had simply trusted her advisors. Perhaps most devastating was testimony about specific instances where payments had been tied to favors or access. A Middle Eastern businessman testified that he had made substantial transfers to accounts controlled by Camilla in exchange for her arranging private meetings with British government ministers to discuss his business interests. While he acknowledged that these meetings had been described as social occasions rather than official business, the timing and context made clear that they were part of a quid pro quo arrangement. His testimony established that Camilla had been essentially selling access and influence. The defense attempted to counter this testimony by calling character witnesses who spoke about Camilla's charitable work and dedication to her royal duties. They presented evidence of the millions of pounds she had raised for various causes and the countless hours she had devoted to public service. However, this positive testimony seemed to have little impact in the face of the overwhelming documentary evidence of financial crimes. The jury appeared unmoved by arguments that good works in one area could offset criminal behavior in another. Camilla herself faced a crucial decision about whether to testify in her own defense. Her lawyers strongly advised against it, knowing that she would face brutal cross-examination and that any misstep could be fatal to her case. However, Camilla insisted that she wanted to tell her story directly to the jury. Against her lawyers' recommendations, she took the witness stand in what many saw as a desperate gamble to salvage a case that was going very badly. Her testimony was emotional and at times rambling. She described a life of privilege that had left her unprepared to manage complex financial matters. She insisted that she had always relied on professional advisors and had never intentionally violated any laws. She tearfully apologized for any mistakes that had been made but maintained that they were honest errors rather than criminal acts. She portrayed herself as someone who had devoted her life to service and who was now being crucified for technical violations of regulations she did not fully understand. The prosecution's cross-examination was withering. Eleanor Fitzgerald systematically confronted Camilla with the documentary evidence. The emails where she had given specific instructions about moving money to avoid detection, the recorded phone conversations where she discussed tax avoidance strategies, the bank records showing payments from questionable sources that she had personally approved. Each piece of evidence contradicted Camilla's claims of ignorance and passivity. By the end of 2 days of cross-examination, her testimony had done more harm than good to her defense. The closing arguments took place in early May, nearly 6 weeks after the trial had begun. The prosecution reviewed all the evidence methodically, building an overwhelming case that Camilla had knowingly and deliberately engaged in a multi-year scheme to evade taxes and conceal the sources of her wealth. Fitzgerald argued that the evidence showed someone who had cynically exploited her position of privilege while betraying the trust of the British people who had supported the monarchy. She asked the jury to send a message that no one, regardless of status or position, was above the law. The defense's closing argument attempted to appeal to sympathy and to reasonable doubt. Sir Geoffrey argued that the prosecution had failed to prove criminal intent, suggesting that at most, the evidence showed poor judgment and bad advice rather than deliberate criminality. He reminded the jury that Camilla was not a financial expert, and that she had reasonably relied on professionals who had assured her everything was legal. He suggested that convicting an elderly woman who had devoted years to public service would be a miscarriage of justice. However, even Sir Geoffrey seemed to recognize that his arguments were unlikely to prevail, given the strength of the evidence. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood to deliver the findings. On the primary charge of tax evasion, the jury found Camilla guilty. On multiple counts of money laundering, guilty. On charges of conspiracy to defraud the revenue, guilty. The verdicts were read one after another, each one a hammer blow to any remaining pretense that Camilla had been innocent or had simply made mistakes. She sat motionless as the verdicts were delivered, her face expressionless, though observers noted tears running down her cheeks. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, but the political and constitutional implications began immediately. King Charles issued a brief statement expressing his sadness at the verdicts while respecting the judgment of the court. Palace sources indicated that Camilla would be stripped of her royal titles and removed from the family. There were urgent discussions about whether Charles himself should abdicate, given his association with Camilla's activities and his initial attempts to protect her from accountability. Thomas Whitmore watched the verdicts being delivered from a private viewing room adjacent to the courtroom. He felt no sense of triumph, only a profound sadness that it had come to this. He had never wanted to destroy anyone or bring down the monarchy. He had simply wanted the truth to be known, and for people to be held accountable for their actions regardless of their position. As he left the courthouse that evening, he wondered whether the monarchy would survive this scandal and what kind of country Britain would become in its aftermath. The verdicts reverberated far beyond the courtroom. They represented a fundamental shift in how the British establishment operated, a rejection of the ancient principle that some people were simply too important to be subject to ordinary legal processes. Thomas Whitmore had helped bring about that change by choosing duty to truth over loyalty to individuals. Whatever else history might say about him, he had proven that one person willing to speak up could still make a difference, even against the most powerful institutions in society.